Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Tom Collier, the Painting Fool. Today I'll be demonstrating a watercolor landscape painting from my imagination. I do on occasion paint from photographs, but I use them only for inspiration and compositional guidelines. However, I do not keep the image in sight as I'm painting. The reason for this is that it tends to make me want to duplicate the photo exactly, and after all, what I'm doing is creating my own interpretation of the scene and hopefully an emotional response to it. I'll be using 12 by 16 Arches cold press 140-pound watercolor paper, core watercolors, and brushes by Sterling Edwards and Princeton. I use a combination of wet on wet and wet on dry technique, along with lifting and scraping when the situation calls for it. I'll try to narrate as I paint with details about color choices and brushes. So, let's get started. Okay, well, let's get started with some plain water, clear water. We're going to wet the area that's going to turn out to be the sky. And down to about where you want your horizon to be. It doesn't have to be any more than that. Alright, and then next we're going to take some ultramarine blue. Oh, by the way, that was a 1.5 inch Princeton flat wash that we used to put that water on there. Now we'll take some ultramarine blue and we're going to mix that with some burnt sienna, and that'll create kind of a nice gray that we're going to use up in our sky. We're going to make it kind of a overcast day. Okay, so I think sometimes that's more interesting than, you know, just plain blue sky as far as visually in a painting anyway. But, you know, there's nothing wrong with a blue sky either. Alright, we'll mix a little bit more of that color, make it a little bit darker so that these clouds have a little bit more form. This will dry considerably lighter when it dries, so you know, don't have to worry about it too much. And you know, the water that's there on the paper is going to make that paint kind of billow out and form some nice cloud-like shapes. All right, we put in a horizon with again some ultramarine blue, very light, to kind of represent maybe some distant hills. And now we're working on the foreground with some quinacridone gold. This will kind of be a bit of a grassy area in the foreground. We'll have you know, a big rock and some trees that live there in the foreground, and then we'll have some trees that are just over the hill, and we're going to put those in next. Here's where the rock lives, and you know, some shapes for some foreground grasses and bushes, and now we'll mix up some more of that gray color to be shadows of these trees that live down the hill, just over the hill. By the way, we're using a Sterling Edwards number 12 round for this foreground work. And now we're mixing up some green gold, and we'll kind of, you know, dab that in to be the highlights of on the tops of these trees. And then we'll take some sap green also and kind of put that in areas to give the trees a little three-dimensional shape and to add some textural interest. If you really look at trees, rarely are they all just one color of green. So we'll put some layers in here and create some nice looking trees that live just down over the hill. These are just the tops of the trees sticking up. And now with some more of that green gold, we're going to put in, and some quinacridone gold, we're going to put in the area where the valley is beyond those trees. And this is why we're going to call this painting the Golden Valley. Okay, and then we'll add some more shapes to these trees back here. This is some Viridian green, a little bit darker yet. And then we'll put some Payne's Gray in with that Viridian green and create some even deeper, darker shadows. When all these layers are finished, it ends up giving these trees an awful lot of shape, and that's what we want. We want that contrast. Little burnt sienna in the valley area to give this some texture, even not a whole lot, because this is off in the distance, so it's going to appear to be somewhat less detailed, I guess is the expression I'm looking for. Okay, now I'm using the number 4 Princeton fan brush and picking up some quinacridone gold, and we're kind of putting in some the impression of some grassiness, some and then adding a little burnt sienna as well in there. And oops, that's a little dark. I think we'll try to lift some of that out of there. And we'll do that with just some Kleenex. So, if you get areas that, you are a little bit darker and you want it to be, you can always take some of that paint back out, either with dabbing with a Kleenex or sometimes even with a dry brush. And using the chiseled end on the Sterling Edwards brush to scratch in a little suggestion of a few tree branches here and there poking out. And now back to the number 12 round, and we'll put some shadow areas in to this rock and give it some form. A little bit of fan brush there to suggest some grass that's poking up around the rock. And then we're going to take a part of a plastic card and scrape it a little bit. As will give us some rock-like textures. And that's what we want there. We may need to come back to that a little bit again. It's still a little wet, so not quite as showing up quite as much as I'd like. Okay, now I've got the 1-inch flat from Sterling Edwards, and taking some raw umber and some burnt umber, and we're going to put in a couple of trees in the foreground. That's my dog. Somebody must be walking down his street, so he's letting them know he's not happy about that. He's very protective of his street in front of the house here. So we get these trunks in here, and then we're going to go back to some green gold along with that flat 1-inch flat brush, and we'll start putting in some foliage up here toward the top of the tree, or trees I should say. And then a little sap green again to try to give us some form, so it doesn't look too flat. We'll be putting quite a few layers on here as well, so we wind up with something that has a three-dimensional feel to it, more so than just a two-dimensional flat image. And then some Viridian again, to create the darkest areas. And I think you can see, how that the layers from light to dark add, interesting shape and textures to that foliage area. We're going to take our palette knife now and scrape in little highlights on the trunk so that they look round instead of just flat lines, and we can use that palette knife to do a little further scraping on the rock. We take some Kleenex and kind of lift out some highlights. On those trees. And then we've got the fan brush. I'm going to put some, dab some texture back in here. Some of the darker greens that we've been using. Okay, we cleaned our brush, and now we're going to pick up some of Core Watercolor's Titanium White, which, as it turns out, is pretty darn opaque. It's covering over these darker colors pretty well. I'm actually somewhat impressed with it. It's the first time I've used it. And we're putting in some birch or aspen. Some people call them aspen trees or birch trees that are going to live over here on the other side. Just kind of give the scene a little bit of balance. And then these types of trees, as they get down closer to the ground, they tend to have a lot of darker areas. So I've got some Payne's Gray and some burnt umber, and we kind of put those textures in. And some small branches. Right now I'm using the Sterling Edwards rigger. It's a number 6 rigger, I believe. And I'll pick up the fan brush and go back to the green gold and put some foliage up here. And we're going to keep this foliage lighter in color than the other trees. The aspens tend to have a light green colored foliage that turns bright yellow in the fall. So we'll also, we're going to put some quinacridone gold in here. Kind of give that a little bit of interest. And we'll kind of dab in a few small twigs and branches up here towards the top. Do the same thing over on this group of trees. Not a whole lot. Don't want to overdo it. And I think there's not a whole lot left to do here, except maybe sign it. You always want to remember to sign your name on the front of your paintings. This is your way of claiming ownership that you created this image, and it's very important. So it doesn't have to be, a big neon sign. Find a rather discreet area of the painting and just put your name in there so people looking at it know that it's yours. And that's about, taking us to the end of things here. I want to thank everybody for watching, and if you learned something from it, that's great. Give me a thumbs up. We welcome your comments, and I encourage you to consider subscribing as well, and look forward to uploading more videos in the future.